the final event has kind of is very important move from, say, the first live event I did, which was the preview, the walk and talk tour, and then when there was the In Conversation session with Annabella Poland. And so now this is very much me chairing and moving to hear the voices of 4 people who have particular significance for me. And part of the introduction is I will kind of flag up what that significance is too. I invited them and was really delighted that all 4 said yes to doing this, because this is a bit of a tough challenge, because I've asked them to respond to what does We Are Social History mean to them, and they've only got 10 minutes to do it in. So, you could talk for hours on this subject. So, but each 10-minute presentation is going to offer a very interesting perspective on this phrase. And as some people will be aware, that this statement was originally made to me by Ruth Mcdougall on the project Travelling the Archive. And we also, Bella and I, finish with this statement in the mini graph. So that's why I'm really pleased to have now 4 different views in response. So yeah, so how we're going to run the seminar then is that I will do the introductions now, and then Annie will begin. And then each speaker will then follow. It would be Catherine, then it'd be Alishia, and then it would be Isolt. And again, keeping in mind the importance of the question and discussion session with the audience. And we hope to be probably wrapping up about 3:25. So thank you very much for coming along, especially as it's a sunny day here in this part of Scotland at any rate. So yes, the point of the seminar then is to explore photography's enduring relationship with this theme of social history, and also in relation to photographic history, as well as through to contemporary practice. So I'll now move to my kind of formal introductions to all 4 of our contributors today. And I want to start off with Anne Leiden, who is Chief Curator of Photography at the National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh, where she was responsible for a collection of over 55,000 photographs. And she's curated numerous exhibitions, and I believe she's very busy at the moment with Thomas Joshua Cooper's forthcoming show at the galleries in the summer. And she's co-authored several books, including most recently A Perfect Chemistry, the photographs of Hill and Adamson, and that was 2017. And through a specific photographs from the National Galleries of Scotland collection, Annie will discuss their role in understanding social photographic practices. And the reason why I was really keen to include Annie in this discussion is that in 2014, I had my first visit to the print room at the National Galleries of Scotland with Annie, which has proved to be a very enduring and influential conversation, which began over the pictures of Thomas Annan, George P. Lewis, and Milton Rogovan. So I'm really delighted that she will be our first speaker. And she will then be followed by Catherine McPhee, who I'm really delighted is joining us from the Isle of Skye. And she's an archivist who's grown up on the Isle of Skye. And this has really allowed her to engage with the community groups across Skye and Lochoush while preserving and protecting the culture. She's currently studying for her MLit in Archives and Records Management at Dundee University. And Catherine also manages the Skye and Lochoush Archive Centre in Portree on the Isle of Skye. So with her strong knowledge of local culture and deep connection to the Isle of Skye, Catherine's going to draw out the significance of selected photographs from the Archive Centre, including those made by so-called amateur photographers. And collaborations with archivists has been really crucial for my projects, a number of projects that are currently on show at street level. And the project Travelling the Archive, the archivist at the Skye and Lochoush Archive Centre brought the Joan Wilcock collection to the Kailaka community in a number of ways, and in more ways than one. And so moving from that period of 2015 to 16, that project took place, and moving then the collection to street level in 2019, 2020, Catherine was really instrumental in helping us do that. And that collection is now been showing in the form of a rolling digital slideshow, thanks to her help. And Catherine will then be followed by Alishia, possibly with Alishia Farnan's cat as well. And she's a Glasgow-based photographer who's worked with social architecture. And her images are part of one and singular and continuous archive project. And the most recent addition to her archive is a body of work looking at social spaces in Ukraine left over from the Soviet era. And Alishia will discuss her ongoing project, photographic practice in relation to social spaces from Scotland's working miners' clubs to Eastern European palaces of culture. And I'm really pleased Alishia is our first practitioner who will be contributing to this afternoon's talk, series of talks, because I went to a very memorable talk of her work when she was in the Jill Todd Photographic Exhibition Award, and that was 2018 at street level. And she was talking about her body of work, Social State, which centered on miners' social clubs. And Legacy includes a photo essay of mine in a vitrine from Casino to Showroom, which was also attempting to respond to a site of a miners' club that was burnt down in the 1960s. And this project was, this photo essay was really dealing with something, what happens when it fails, something doesn't work. And so I'm really delighted that, to see that Alishia's got this really kind of in-depth, very successful series of works that she's been doing. So where one photographer and artist might fail, another can bring a very distinctive kind of successful visualization to similar themes. And last not least is Isolt Timmermans, and she's going to be our last speaker, and also coming from the viewpoint of a practitioner. And she's been involved in making photographic work and creating opportunities for others across a range of settings, working at street level. So she'll be very familiar to you in the audience, to many of you, working at street level on education and outreach projects since the late 1990s. And her photography is really rooted in collaborative practice, exploring techniques and ideas with others across a variety of contexts. And Isolt will reflect on aspects of her work within Multi-Story, Street Level's long-term community-based photography project that ran from the Red Road Flats in Glasgow. And this ran from 2004 to 2014, and specifically the work of young people whose voices remain underrepresented in relation to this theme of social history. So again, another kind of distinctive contribution for this afternoon. And Isolt's multi-story work has long been on my mind, and it went, you can see that it predated and it went beyond a project of mine, Beneath the Surface Hidden Place, which was 2007 to 10, and that's the opening series in the exhibition. And while my project worked with small places like villages and towns, and Isolt worked with the iconic Red Road Flats in Glasgow, over the years I was really struck by the thematic links about what we were investigating. And these were also explored in an essay of mine called Whither the Roots, Photographing the Erased Home, which is also included in one of the vitrines. So hopefully giving you a sense of what we've got to look forward to, but also the choice and the relationship with the exhibition. And I'm now going to now pass over to Annie, who will now kind of share her presentation with us.
Thanks to Nicky, thanks to Street Level for today's event. I'm Annie, I'm Chief Curator of Photography at NGS, and responsible for a collection of photographs that date from the beginnings of photography in the early 1840s to the present day. As the National Galleries of Scotland, we have a national remit, and the collection essentially belongs to the people of Scotland, for the people of Scotland. Our collections therefore very much fit into the ethos of we are social history, from the point of view of what is recorded, how it's collected, and who it's for. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the collection, highlighting different makers and work from across the centuries, but all are connected through the particular thread of social history in its widest application. I'm going to begin with David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson, who had a photographic partnership in Edinburgh in the mid-1840s. While they would not necessarily have seen their work as social history, that was a discipline that wouldn't emerge until 100 years later. I do think that we can look back on their work as examples of social history from that time period. The two photographers took their camera equipment down to the small fishing village of Newhaven, just 2 miles from their studio on Carlton Hill. And there at the shore, they made over 100 photographs of the people and their community, intending to publish a book, The Fishermen and Women of the Firth of Forth, but it was never realised. These are very much portraits of working class people at a time when there was much political turmoil and social unrest all over Europe. The rise of the proletariat led to revolutions in some countries, and there was a curiosity, if not fear, by some of the upper classes in understanding this socio-economic group. It's within this context that Hill and Adamson made these photographs and intended to sell them in bound volumes to an audience that would have been interested in the subject. Newhaven was a fiercely independent village, known for its bravery and courage in fishing the harsh North Sea waters for herring and shellfish. Men worked at sea, often away for weeks at a time, in poorly constructed wooden boats that would later be declared as among the most dangerous in Britain. And the women worked on shore, sorting the fish and loading the catch into their creel baskets that they carried on their backs into Edinburgh to sell. There's no doubt the images are aesthetically pleasing. The subject matter was picturesque and the sitters were clearly posed, but there is so much of the social constructs and hierarchies bound up in these photographs to simply see them as pretty pictures. Changes in Scottish society, from Highland clearances and Irish migration to full onset of industrialisation of major towns and cities, meant growth was exponential. One photographer who captured this exponential growth was Thomas Annan, who established his photographic studio in Glasgow in the 1850s. His first major body of work documented the construction and route of the Glasgow waterworks, an ambitious engineering feat that saw 50 million gallons of fresh, clean water pumped from Loch Katrine in the Trossachs into Glasgow each day. Annan's photographs show the progress from its construction in the Highlands right down to the memorial fountain built in 1872 in the manicured gardens of Kelvin Grove Park. His photographs form part of the narrative celebrating human effort in harnessing nature. But city officials could not stem the flow of the city's rapid population growth, and with it the challenges of overcrowding. A lot of immigrants to Glasgow settled in the salt market area of the city, and as early as 1843, a health report on the living conditions of the working classes called out the appalling conditions of the dwellings. Annan photographed these same very closes 25 years after the original report, and although there is evidence of improvement in the intervening years, the street lighting and the bell carts used to carry off the dry refuse, the challenges seemed insurmountable to the city and the buildings were demolished. Before they were torn down, Annan made around 30 photographs that featured in his publication Photographs of Old Closes and Streets, providing a photographic legacy of these dwellings and their inhabitants to go alongside the statistics and figures. From the 19th century, we jump into the 20th and the works of Edith Tudor Hart, who was born Edith Schusitzky in 1908 in Vienna, Austria. Edith turned her attention to photography, enrolling in the foundation course at the Bauhaus in Germany in 1928. She used her camera as a critical tool in documenting the social injustices of a changing landscape. Her activities, however, were increasingly at odds with authorities, and in 1933 she went into exile in England. In London, she exhibited regularly with the Artists International Association and was an active member of the Workers' Camera Club. Her work continued to be socially engaged, and many of her subjects reveal the realities of Britain's working classes in the 1930s and 40s. From poverty-stricken families in London's East End to unemployed workers marching in South Wales. Her photographs appeared in British publications such as Lilliput and Picture Post, including her 1949 photographic essay titled A School Where Love is the Cure, which is what you see here on the screen. It covered the work of the Camphill School near Aberdeen, which was founded by an Austrian exile, Karl Koenig, for children with learning disabilities. Edith's personal politics continued to play a role in her life, and her involvement in the Cambridge spy ring meant she was under regular surveillance by British intelligence. In 1951, she destroyed most of her photographic records, although continued to photograph, publishing work into the 1950s that concentrated on issues of child welfare, health and education. She died in Brighton in 1973. However, some 40 years later, working with her family, the National Galleries of Scotland were able to make modern prints from her original negatives, and these were the subject of an exhibition and publication in 2013. Like Tudor Hart, American Larry Hermann came to Britain because of war, although in his case it was in protest of the Vietnam War. Larry is interested in documenting the working class and photographing the labour force. During the mid-1970s, he came to the west of Scotland to document the region during a particular moment of socio-economic upheaval. Much like Hill and Adamson with their New Haven pictures of the 1840s, he intended to publish a book of his photographs, but for several reasons it did not come to be. He did, however, make a dummy for the book project, and this maquette, which you see here on the screen, was put together by hand by him, alongside typed up captions and statistics to go with the photographs. In his preface, he wrote, "Primarily using photography, I've constructed a statement about a specific geographical area whose people are on their knees, tossed this way and that way by the vagaries of capitalism. If their economic well-being is desperate, an extraordinary militant past teaches that the future is theirs to make. And of course, I can only suggest the future by depicting the present." Captions included contextual information to be read alongside his images, such as the list shown here, which records prices of groceries in 1974, and then compared the same brands and products in 1976 to illustrate the rate of inflation and how it was hitting the average person. Most things doubled in price. For example, a tin of spaghetti hoops and tomato sauce cost 8.5p in 1974, and just 2 years later, it was 16p. Although the book was never published, as a physical object, the dummy is a particularly important relic of that endeavour and the 1970s period. NGS acquired the book and a large group of loose prints from the Clydeside project for the National Collection. Works also come into the collection via donations, and one such gift was a group of works by Milton Rogovan. American photographer Rogovan visited Scotland in 1982 because he wanted to photograph Scottish miners as part of a large global project portraying mine workers from all around the world. He photographed them at work, at home, and at leisure, also documenting the communities in which they lived. Although all his sitters remained anonymous, with only their geographic location serving as a title, he treated everyone with respect at a time that was increasingly fractious here in Britain. If you remember, this is only 2 years before the miners' strike. Milton travelled around Ayrshire, Fife, and the Lothians, meeting mining families. These photographs are important legacy for many of these communities that are no longer defined by mining, yet continue to be shaped by their mining past. Whereas Hill and Adamson and Annan captured the industrialisation as it was sweeping around the country in the 1800s, what Hermann and Rogovan recorded is the deindustrialisation of Scotland as it was beginning in the 1970s and 80s. All of them, though, are effectively recording the changes to the communities and towns of Scotland. For my final slide, I'm looking at the work of Margaret Mitchell, who photographed her family over a period of 20 years. The photographs are drawn from 2 bodies of work, Family, made in 1994, and then In This Place, made around 2016-17. She initially focused on her sister Andrea and her 3 children, Stephen, Kelly, and Chick, who can be seen in the photograph on the top left. At the time, they were living in the Raploch housing scheme in Stirling. Margaret states that she was motivated by the political situation at the time that stigmatised single mothers living in council estates, people just like her sister. The personal project was highlighting an experience felt by many, and with her later work in this place, Margaret poignantly demonstrates that social mobility is often dictated by the systems in place and people have little opportunity to change their situation. In the preface to her recent book Passage, which features both bodies of work, she states, "I want the viewer to ask themselves a question about how society operates, how choice is related to opportunity and environment, to see that sometimes people choose what they do because really not much has been offered in the first place." In closing, I hope that I've demonstrated how the vast collections of NGS contain wonderful and diverse examples of social history. From the very beginnings of photography to the work made in the last few years, these photographs are evidence of how society operated at those times and reveals what structures and systems were in place. I also hope it shows how these histories are connected and that in turn we are connected, resonating with Ruth Mcdougall's words, "We are social history." Thank you.
Thanks very much, Annie. That was fabulous. There's a lot to come back to there. And we'll hold on to some of those thoughts of the photographer's positions and critical positions as well as personal positions, and come back to that. I'll be very interested to talk about. But now if we can now invite Catherine to share her screen and follow on from Annie.
So thank you, Nicky, and thank you, Street Level, for inviting me on. So as Nicky explained, I'm the archivist at the Skylar House Archive Centre. So I'm one of 4 archives that come under the Highland Archive Service. We conserve and make accessible records which reflect the history and diversity of the Scottish Highlands and Islands for the benefit of present and future generations. I'm very fortunate and very lucky to be based at the one in Skylar House. It's where I'm from, so it's an absolute joy to spend my day going through the archives. The way we understand the past is shaped through artefacts and records that have been left behind by previous generations. These archives influence our history, heritage, and identity. In the past, archives have been understood as neutral and passive and partially accumulating over time, yet in fact they are socially constructed discourses or narratives embedded within power relationships. As such, the archive is implicated in what we understand about the past and whose stories are told. Indeed, archives are full of silences, where the stories of the marginalised and the oppressed remain hidden. Social history derives its vitality from oppositional character, priding itself on being concerned with real life rather than ideals with ordinary people, rather than the privileged elites. I'm going to start today with a couple of images from the McDonald collection. These date from the late 1880s. They were created by Charles S. Bain, selection of glass slides. They're absolutely stunning. The first day I started the archives, these were the first images I looked at. Alan R. McDonald was Charles Bain's brother-in-law, and he owned a Wattonish estate on Skye. This collection features the McDonald family portraying Victorian era in Skye. Woven in between the collection of the privileged, we can find examples of estate workers, crofters, and members of the community. The image I'm showing at the moment is of Peter Mckinnon, who was born in 1828 in the township of Glendale, which is in the northwest of Skye. Peter was a crofter, he was a seaman, and he was also the Glendale postman. His voice was one of the many heard during the late 1880s as land questions became a major issue in the locality, which is still an ongoing discussion today. Here we have a selection of workers, and this is in Ardmore. The scenery and landscape here is still very similar as if you were to drive up there today. And this croft is actually one of my friends. It's still a working family croft. And it's just one of these images that capture that wee moment of life on Skye in the late 1880s. A celebration of everyday life, even perhaps especially when it involves hardship and suffering, social history establishes an altogether intimate rapport, inviting us back into the warmth of the past and recognise kingship to our people. I peer into records of social history left behind in many forms. It could be letters, photographs, images, tweed, it can be a range. Some images have only been shared within the family. This collection next is created by Ian Wilkinson, details Mary Nicholson's family in Ballymeenach in Braes. And I journeyed into a once private life, carefully moving from image to image, replaying and reimagining the events these records have left behind. Capturing family, community spirit, events, and settings deemed essential to the creator's spirit. Hand shearing sheep here and at the Fank in Ballymena in the 1980s. And this is a cultural significance, the Gaeltacht identity that's been captured. These two images here, we've got Flora Nicholson on her own there, shearing the sheep. And next to her, we've got Flora and Mary. So Mary was her youngest daughter, who was the partner of the photographer. And the sheep is called Marilyn, apparently was the pet sheep as well. So you get these little details that are given to you by families when they come to deposit images. The communicative, performative and conversational qualities of images held within the archives are in their plentitude, and their variety constitutes significant evidence of a lived experience. It's a slightly later date from the same Fank, and you can see over to the Isle of Braes in the background there as well. And again, we've got Mary with the headscarf on. So school photographs we have in abundance, and most of them tend to be your kind of memories of neatly poised, everyone facing forwards in uniforms, group photographs, never really reflecting the time we spend in school as children and daily events. This image here comes from Borrowdale Primary School from the mid-1970s. So Borrowdale is in Glendale on the Isle of Skye. And in 1978, there were 6 schools listed in the township. By 1905, only Borrowdale remained open and there were 136 pupils on the school roll. By the 1940s, we were down to 25. And then the school continued to dwindle and it was finally closed in 2007, the last of the Glendale schools. So there's some obviously doing their lessons outside the school. The school's still there, it belongs to the community now. Some lessons. So social history touches on and arguably helps focus major issues of public debate. It mobilises popular enthusiasm and can engage passions. The final selection today are from Morik Hendrickson. She's a teacher with a long love of Gaelic culture, folk music, singing, storytelling and poetry, and she's also a writer. So Morik has such a range in here. This one is from Portree. So often in Portree, the images we see on postcards and from visitors are of the main street, which has got the pipe band marching down. This one shows Bayfield Lane, which is just off Wentworth Street. And we've got everyone tuning up and getting ready. These are a few images from a Crossroads Street Fair in 1988 in Portree. A selection of community activities, really for me capturing what I remember as a young girl, going to events like this in the village and everyone being there. The crowds, you can see them all sitting on the War Memorial in the square today. Morik, within her collection, also captured some from an early nursery in Portree. The image I used on my first introduction slide was another one of those. I just really enjoy these kids just look like they're having a great time, especially the one in the barrel. The new government housing schemes were approved after the First World War for ex-servicemen and their families in Portree. This image here is of Park Road. It became the first council housing scheme to be built in Skye, providing a total of 12 homes, with the first tenants moving in during 1927 and 28. By the late 1980s, these houses had been demolished and we've now got a car park and community centre there. This is the last image from Morik's collection. This is the doors on the day of demolition of this housing. So the imaginary community with the past can serve as a comfortable alternative to critical awareness and self-questioning, defining the present by association with the past. We are social history by celebrating common humanity.
Thanks, Catherine. That was again really really great to see those images, but also to hear some of those ways that the images are coming in and those conversations you're having around the photographs. And that would also be very good to be able to pick that up. And now what we're going to do now is pass it over to Alishia. Alishia, if you'd like to share your screen.
So what I'm going to talk about today is my practice as a photographer. My practice is rooted in social history. The way that I see social history is through social architecture. So for me, that manifested itself firstly in social clubs, miners' welfares, bowling clubs and ex-servicemen's clubs in Scotland. I come from Lanarkshire, so I'm from a highly industrial area, which has many social clubs and miners' welfares and ex-servicemen's clubs, and they're part of the social landscape of these areas. So the first image here is from the social club that I actually grew up with. It's the social club that I would go for Sunday dinner in. It's a social club that I've been to a wedding in. It's my local social club in Motherwell. So that was the first kind of starting point for me, because it was filled with a kind of warm nostalgia. Just because I think these spaces are so exciting. They're so exciting to me because they say a lot about the area that they're situated in. They say a lot about the people who socialise in them. A lot of spaces like this one here, which is a bowling club in Glasgow, were actually built by the original members. So members for a lot of these places would put a small amount of money in collectively to build these spaces by hand themselves, brick by brick. And they served as a place of socialization for them. They were a place to kind of let loose, have recreational activities, spend time with their friends. You know, there's social clubs around the country that are based on your profession. So there's social clubs that look at miners, for instance. Then there's also Albion Social Club in Glasgow, which is for an old car manufacturer. A lot of the times they are places where people could get a pint after work, they could hang out with their friends, and these spaces are in decline and have been in decline for quite a long time, especially when Margaret Thatcher brought in her deindustrialisation policies in the 1980s, and we started to see the closure of traditional industries such as steel and coal. We started to see the kind of fall of these places, and a lot of these places actually during that time were spaces where people unionised. They were places where people would have meetings and talk about what they could do to try and kind of...
Alishia,
Yeah.
so to interrupt, can I just check? I think there may be a kind of some of the audience having might have to reshare your presentation.
Oh, can you not see my screen?
Yeah, can.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
See it now?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Malcolm's just said he could see it. Right. Okay. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry about that.
Oh, okay.
So I'll go to
Right.
the slide that I was at before, but I'll give. So again, this is a social club that serves almost as an archive of a football team of the past that hasn't existed in quite a considerable amount of time. So these places not only act as what they were used for traditionally, so servicing the community in the ways of having a pint after your shift, or going with your friends at the weekend, or playing a game of bowls. You know, they also serve as function spaces now in the community. So they do weddings and funerals and christenings, and a lot of them unfortunately do have dwindling memberships, so they are in decline. So when I started this project in 2012, the main kind of thing that I wanted to do at that point was document them, because they are in decline. So I wanted to try and get in there before they started to disappear. And as I've been doing this project for almost 10 years now, there has been a lot of clubs that have disappeared, which is unfortunate, because I think that they are a really important part of our social history. They speak a lot to the generations that have passed. They speak a lot to traditions in the areas, and they speak a lot to the importance of having recreational spaces. Like this one, which is Glasgow Indoor Bowling Green, which is just in Mount Florida. So from there, when I started with those, I was thinking maybe, you know, I'll do the project, and it'll be an ongoing project just on social clubs and ex-servicemen's clubs. And then I started to think a bit of a bigger picture, because social history is everywhere, social architecture is everywhere, and it holds so much importance for me. So from there, I started to document spaces like bingo halls, because bingo halls, in a similar way to bowling clubs and miners' welfares, service communities, and they act as a recreational space. And there's a lot of really important activities that go on there. Whilst social clubs generally were for the male population, bingo halls serviced a lot of women in the country, and I think it's quite important to get that broad kind of coverage within the work that I'm making, because I do see it as an archive of these really important places, and I'm hoping to kind of get everything encompassed in the work. After I graduated from university in 2015, I moved to the Isle of Bute for 3 months to work with the Rossi Pavilion project, which is an original Art Deco pavilion that services the community on the Isle of Bute that is currently going through a redevelopment phase, as it was shut down in 2015 so that they could turn it into a kind of more contemporary space. But similarly to the social clubs, it has been servicing the communities for years, and it also functions in a similar way. So I started looking at those, and I then moved on to a project where I went down to traditional seaside towns. I was interested in looking at, again, this kind of dwindling social nature that people have, you know, where in the kind of like mid-century, there was a lot of holidays that people would have in the UK because we weren't as accustomed to flying abroad. So there was lots of places that had significant amounts of travel, Rossi being included in that. As you would say, you went down the water to go to Rossi to have your kind of like long weekend. This is a secondary part of the archival process that I went to England. So I looked at Morecambe and Blackpool, and I looked at their traditional spaces. So that is the casinos, the amusements, the bingo halls, the restaurants, the cafes, the pubs, all of those kinds of spaces, because to me, they still represent social history. You know, they're the kind of everyday spaces that people go into, but they have so much history and they're so rich in legacy. So I think that they are really important for me to be continuing in the archival project. So that's some more pictures from England. And then kind of everywhere that I go, I try and document traditional spaces. So this is a traditional cafe in Sweden that I went to in 2019, where I was kind of continuing the process of looking at these spaces. Because the project is so fluid, it just continues, whether I've got a direct kind of route of what I want to take pictures of, or whether I'm kind of just going about my life and seeing these spaces, because I genuinely quite like to spend my time in them anyway. So a lot of the time I do come across them just out and about, which is great. And then in 2019, I was lucky enough to do a residency in Ukraine, which was through the British Council. And I was hosted in a city called Dnipro in Ukraine for 1 month towards the end of 2019. And what I did during that residency was I started to consider what social spaces, traditional social spaces, look like in ex-Soviet countries. So for Ukraine, a lot of the social spaces there are palaces of culture. Palaces of culture are left over from the USSR, and they are kind of multi-purpose spaces that were used for all kinds of recreation back then. During the USSR times, the kind of celebration of religion was taken away, and there was kind of forced atheism on people. So they had these spaces as a way of kind of celebrating the people in these spaces instead of going to celebrate a deity or a god in religious spaces. So these kind of acted as a multi-purpose space. A lot of them had cinemas, they had dancing rooms, they had cafes. There's ones that have rooms specific for playing cards. They service the community for decades. And similarly to the social clubs that we see in the UK, they're also in decline after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. a lot of them do still stand to service the community to these days, but a lot of them are quite dilapidated. The ones that are in quite good states of repair just now are actually privatised, which I think is quite an interesting kind of journey for the social clubs, given that they were very much for the community by the community. This is an example of one of the cinemas in one of the old palaces of culture. And this is a social space in one of the other palaces of culture. So looking at those, it's looking at the community effort for a lot of people. Do you know, these places are kept and maintained by people in the community, much like they are over here. And I think that that's really important. So tying that into, you know, we are social history. We are social history. Everything that we do is social history. Everything that we do in our spare time has so much importance. And the work that I do tries to document the importance of these everyday spaces, because I really think that they need to be archived. I really do. I think that, especially with the decline that we're seeing in social clubs and palaces of culture, these places are going to go because generations are changing their attitudes towards socialization. They've got different interests, they've got different jobs. So it makes sense that these places would go into decline and we would stand to get other types of recreation in the future. But I think whilst we still have them, it's really important to celebrate the spaces that people generations past have spent their everyday in. So that's what I see as social history, and that's me.
Thanks very much, Alishia. And I do think the way that you photograph these spaces is really is really quite compelling as well. And so it'd be good to talk about the approaches to the spaces, but this underlying point that you're making about these community changes, and how long these spaces will exist. Thanks very much. So now I shall pass on to Isolde and invite her to share her screen, and she will be our last presenter of the day.
So yeah, thanks. Great to be asked, Nicky, to look back on this work. So really difficult task, to be fair, to try and capture in 10 minutes sort of elements of a 10-year project really that started in 2004. People always say the project was based in the Red Road flats, but the truth is it was a project working with people that lived in the Red Road flats, which I guess is a big distinction. It started with the people as a project supporting asylum seekers and refugees coming to Glasgow, and the main distribution centre orientation centre was one of these blocks leased out by the YMCA, and that was where all asylum seekers coming to Glasgow would be initially processed, and then some would remain there and others would be rehoused. So we were introduced, I was introduced to the Red Road flats and this system through a young participant. I was doing a project with young Kosovan refugees at the time, and it was a really powerful project, using photography with people who were new to the city, obviously suffering from different aspects of trauma and disorientation. And at the time as well, there was a lot of negative association with refugees and asylum seekers coming to Glasgow. It was the first big influx into the city, and in a lot of the areas that they were being housed in, it was a new kind of aspect of multiculturalism in the areas. So we found photography was a really fabulous way to welcome people, help them orientate to their surroundings, give them the opportunity to take control over viewing aspects of their life, and exploring the environment. Lots of people were involved in this project over the 10-year course of its history, so I'm not able to present all of the work, obviously, or even credit all the different artists that were involved. So I'm really just showing you a snapshot of the work, focusing on photography done with young people, and then the kind of work that really tried to reach out broader across the community as the flats were in the kind of final stages of demolition. So what we're looking at, as I'm flicking through here, I'm probably going to lose my thread completely, is these are photographs taken by young people. Yeah, we ran a weekly photography class for young people. So we experimented with digital cameras, we used pinhole cameras, film cameras, Holgers, and these are actually some poster works. So it was an important aspect of the project, was also about sharing the work that was made with the young people. That was both as a way of empowering them and honouring, respecting their achievements, but it was also a way of reaching out to the broader community and raising awareness of the refugee experience, if you like. And that wasn't always about through talking about refugee related experience. It was also about allowing people, particularly young people, to be creative and to have a role in their immediate environment that wasn't dictated by their status. So that was quite important. Fun underpinned a lot of it. As the project unfolded, so we started working in 2014, and the project was working with refugees and asylum seekers. The core aim of it was about their emotional and social orientation in Glasgow. That kind of extended to the celebration of multiculturalism and raising awareness of the refugee experience through events, and we had a project website and exhibitions in the city centre in various places. It was around 2007 that the plan to demolish the Red Road Flats was announced. And at that point in time, the Red Road Flats project was set up. The kind of decant of the Scottish community began in earnest, and kind of even more asylum seekers on these temporary lets were kind of extended out beyond the YMCA building into some of the other 8 blocks in the Red Road as well. So within the kind of 8 years that the project was active, there was a massive difference in the physical environment. And some of the young people that I worked with in 2004, 2005 were still working with me up to 2012. So there were big changes in the physical environment. A little nod to some of Nicky's work here. This project, this was done around, I think, 2011, something like that. This was one of the last photography kind of sessions that I ran. And this is actually a photograph that this girl took 3 years previously. So we were looking at pictures that they'd taken a few years ago and revisiting the same spots. And I showed them Nicky's work. So that was, I mean, another element of the project was just introducing young people to different types of photography in a way any photography class would do. I don't know how well you can see this as a series, but these are all taken, I don't know, roughly a year apart or something like that. You can kind of see the demise. So it was a really strange time to be working in an area, especially thinking around issues of community, and when the actual physicality was of the physical environment was being pulled down, and just as you can imagine, for young people living there, potentially a really traumatizing place to be living in. So we found lots of ways to try and use photography as a way of having a different relationship with the environment, having a kind of like a different lens to see things through. And with the announcement of the demolition schedule, the Red Flats project was set up, which was a partnership between Glasgow Life and GHA. Just going to get some notes up here because I feel like I'm waffling and not saying anything that I meant to. Yes, so that worked with any organisations that were active in the area. So that was a brilliant kind of milestone in the project in a way. Previously, we had been working from the community space in the YMCA on the 28th floor, and we were able to secure a whole half floor on the 23rd floor of 10 Red Road Court. So we had a kind of dedicated project space. And with the establishment of the Red Road project, I also started engaging with some of the ex-residents and the original residents, and making connections with the young refugees and the previous residents, and kind of introducing more of the history of the flats. There was a kind of archaeological side to it, began with the first demolition. There was a lot of actual personal objects that had still been in the first flat that were blown out and scattered across the lawn, which was the kids' route to school. So we went around and kind of catalogued and photographed some of those objects. And rather than seeing it as rubbish, you know, we really started to encourage them to see it as treasure, you know, and clues of past lives. And I think there was something that was really apparent, that when change happens at such a fast rate, the concept of history or of a time gone by, if you like, can be really a matter of a few short years. One of the things, I guess, that and lots of kind of just strange anomalies. This is kind of diving back in time a little bit, just to sort of reference, because that's all I have time to do really, that the project, so started in 2004, was launched at street level in 2005 with some of the original participants, some of their work, a group of young refugees who'd been involved in filmmaking, with virtual migrants, and Pooch Chauhan, who was a visiting artist at the time for street level on the project, performed at the opening event, and that launched the project website, which was in 7 languages. This was a later exhibition at the Gallery of Modern Art. And again, this is when we had starting to engage with some of the original residents and not just the refugee community. That's a little screen grab of the website. Unfortunately, the website isn't online anymore due to modern technology and lost domain names, but hopefully at some point we will be able to retrieve some of that work, because it was an incredible kind of resource and showcase of people's work. This is the community studio that we established. So it had workshop areas, little photographic studio. We turned the corridor into a gallery. That was another little secondary gallery workshop room. It was also an obscura. We had a dark room in the kitchen. And from that space, we were able to do a lot more kind of dedicated work. This was a collaboration with the Integration Network, who commissioned me to work with one family on a project for Refugee Week. It was like a day in the life, so to spend a week with the family and document their day-to-day life. Well, because I didn't really work in a documentary way, I did it in usual fashion of giving them all cameras. We had a range of film cameras, digital cameras, Polaroid cameras, and we all took pictures through that week. And the final piece was really beautiful. It was an audio-visual piece with Antonia giving a dialogue over the images, and that was screened locally as part of Refugee Week, and also went on to be a training resource for some GHA staff. So that was really positive. We also created a version that was kind of image and text panels that went around several community venues and events. So there was sort of different strands. There's campaigning strands to the work, and also just young people representing themselves and their environment as well. This was from a project during 16 Days of Action to eliminate violence against women. I think I'm probably running out of time already. I didn't start.
Yeah, I've just sent you a message, Isel, just to say maybe a minute or two to wrap it up.
Totally through all of this then, sorry. So there was lots of work done with lots of people. This was the kind of the block that I worked in for the longest time, 10 Red Red Court, documented from the inside out with in over 300 photographs, which went into the Glasgow Museum's collection. But ultimately, it all led to a final event where we tried to bring lots of strands of work together. It was a collaboration with Glasgow University. We had portraits on show, people who grew up in the flats across the decades, archive photos, community choir, parades, children, 100 bed sheets, and performance speakers located within the stripped out framework of the building. And this is 2-minute clip, Nicky. So this is just shows a wee bit. And it was an attempt to kind of create a space where everybody could come together with the different memories before the physical landscape was changed completely. Sorry.
No, don't say sorry. Don't say sorry. That was a kind of a very affecting, emotional moment to kind of close the presentation on. Thank you very much, Isol. It was a mean challenge, me saying do this in 10 minutes. I realised that was that was a beautiful ending. So if we can invite all our speakers to come back onto their to come back and join us now, and also first of all to say yes, thanks to our four presenters there, and this is where also I want to just look at the chat and also begin to have this this dialogue with the audience. And perhaps I could start off with asking all four of you something that really struck me, and perhaps this is something that each one of you might want to say something about, and you know, even about what you were doing, but also what you might have noticed about each other's presentations. But I was very struck about how you all were bringing out the connection of we are social history, but also looking at what the motivations are for photographers who are either the insiders or coming in for the outsiders, but also the motivations, but there's also kind of this political and personal dimension that was kind of running through quite a lot of the work that was talked about. Now, Annie, even in some of those kind of, you know, those historical moments that you were talking about, saying about sort of what we might call the social conscious at some point, but also yes, where different kind of groups of people, different, you know, whether they would have, you know, be seen as kind of working class groups, but also that kind of awareness about how groups of people are portrayed, how certain kinds of histories, thinking, Catherine, about people coming and depositing their photographs and giving you this other kind of information about their about the surrounding things that may not be obvious from the photographs, but thinking of those future users and saying that these details, the name of this animal is important, and here are these details, so sort of fleshing out that social history. So that's, I suppose, I'm kind of making a kind of you know, quite a comment and emotional. I've got to be aware of that I'm not making a lot of noise, so I've tried to take off a zip, and I've got this kind of crazy, this black and white thing seems to be making the screen go a bit funny, but yeah, so I just wondered what you thought about those kind of motivations and running through all of your presentations in relation to the images, the photograph, the photographers themselves, and of course yeah, the depositors of things in archives. I don't want to kick that off.
Shall I start maybe?
Yeah.
Is that all right? I mean, I think it was fascinating to hear everyone's talk, because as much as we had some sort of early meetings, we weren't privy to what the other was talking about. And so I was struck by how connected they all were. There was lots of overlap and similarity of whether it was subject matter or sort of approaches that just sort of resonated for all four talks, I think, or four presentations. And I think that part of it is, and I think it was Alishia that had said, you know, like, we are social history, like that. This is it. It's like, we can't escape it. This is who we are. This is what we do. And but we have the kind of the ability of the passage of time to be able to look back on work and to sort of maybe retroactively see it and understand it as to how it accounts for the sort of the political situation, the social situation, the historical situation. And you know, and even hearing Isalt talking about that 10-year project, like, you know, how she started off in doing it. I you know, I don't know if you had any idea, Isalt, it was going to take the 10 years, but already that's like a passage of time as well, and where outcomes are sort of shifting. And now looking back, it has other meaning and resonance as well. So I think it's one thing to take into account sort of motivations, but I think also a lot of it is from a position of today and considering, almost sort of looking back. And I don't by that mean nostalgia, I mean just instead of being able to understand a fuller picture.
I just agree with looking back onto the position of today around images and using history. Something I always say in archives is it's not about living in the past, it's about using that to change the future, open conversations, and see what we can do to change the current and social situation, and that can be anywhere. And that's, to me, I've found that kind of through everyone's presentations today.
Alishia, how about you? What was your thoughts?
I think to understand everything that goes on now, you have to look to the past, but you also have to anticipate the future as well. So it's a kind of weird kind of position to be in, especially as a photographer, because maybe like a year and a half ago, before the pandemic started, I was thinking about social spaces in an archival setting, looking at social clubs and thinking, well, these will probably go at some point, and then gone. They're not open. Do you know, whilst I'm doing this project, everything shifted, and now I can't access the things that I make the work about. So it feels more poignant now than ever. But I really do think that we are all social history. I don't think that social history needs to be about the big things. It can encompass the big things, but I also think that the kind of minutiae of every day is really important, and looking at where people, you know, sit and have a coffee, where they sit and have a laugh with their friends, where they play their sports, you know, those things are just as important as really heralded spaces where so-and-so did a talk, or these people did this and that. You know, it all kind of comes together and makes a really important statement for me that's as big as any other, looking at social clubs.
Isol, how about you?
What was the question?
About the motivations, motivations, and also there's a certain kind of social and political dimension, isn't there, to some of the things that that were running across the presentations. And so,
I mean, for me, you know, at the heart of the work with refugees, it was really always about allowing people the capacity to represent themselves, and also not just to represent themselves, not only be the subject, if you like, but also to be the author. So it was also about empowering people to, you know, give them tools to explore their environment in a different way, that kind of overcame some of the fear, because some of these environments were quite scary. And then through the process of that, and the timeline and what unfolded, I mean, Annie said, no, I mean, when I started the project in the Red Road, it was 1 year funding. So there was only one point in time when we had a block of 3 year funding. Other than that, it was always only ever a 1 year project that I just couldn't drag myself away from.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think also, these timescales that sometimes you can have, put these in a way, they can be defined by funding and all the rest of it, but there is this, the experience that I've had, that usually only starts scratching the surface, and that's why it needs this other time, and then it goes on for another time, and it becomes this chain reaction that goes on. And especially if you're trying to realize that to get some kind of depth and not skim through things, and also not skim through not only what people's photographs and stories, but also it's actually understanding what's going on. Some of these things, what's gone across all 4 presentations as well, is those moments when there's been quite momentous change, even if there's this very big change, and then there's all those kind of mini changes that happen just with, you know, you could be looking the other way and something is gone. Something's gone from that landscape, but it's being carried around in people's memories. And the other thing I was kind of curious about, and this is again more of a comment to throw out to across all 4 of you, is what it's about the insider and the outsider role. And sometimes the photographer is very much inside their project, you know, and then somebody's coming in from the outsider. And the reason why I mention that is obviously I've been in more of the outsider role, but I often hear people talk about it. Actually, it can be in quite it's not in an ungenerous way either, where people can have lived in a place for 20 years, but they're always referring to themselves as incomers, in deference to their friends who have, you know, been born and raised in the area and have witnessed those things. And so what do you think about that, those kinds of tensions? You know, if you see those as being relevant in any of your areas of work?
I mean, I think it is very much relevant, and I think it's also there's no one size or one approach fits all. You know, it's sort of, you know, in many respects, you know, Hill and Adamson were, you know, of a means and living in the, you know, the sort of the new town of Edinburgh, going down to the shores of the Forth. So there was a completely different sort of social strata that they were inserting themselves into, and then they were sort of marketing their work to, again, a kind of, you know, a clientele that could afford to buy these sort of sumptuous albums. Right. So you know, you've got, but their sort of ability though to sort of pick out that this was a very interesting community that was, you know, worthy of being highlighted and should be sort of shared with a wider audience, and you know, trying to understand who that community was and how they operated, you know. So they came in with a degree of respect as well, to then, you know, like people like Tudor Hart and Larry Hermann, who are, you know, non-British but settling in Britain, and turning their cameras, you know, to record the sort of the life and times that they were witness to, and perhaps from an outsider's position in that sense, like there's that perspective. But I think in all of them, it's a kind of interest in humanity that is sort of connecting everybody. And you know, and again, inversely, it's like with Margaret Mitchell, she's looking at something entirely personal, yet it stands for a universal, you know. So it has the ability, I think, to speak to it from, regardless of what your position is and where you're sort of starting from. That again, it just comes back to, we are social history, you know. This is a kind of common experience. Everyone may have a very different sort of reality of it, but we can somehow relate to it because just of the social interactions and those nature. And even with like the Thomas Annan, where there's like, you know, the images I showed were sort of devoid of figures really, but they're all about people. You know, it's all about how do you serve you know, a population that's growing, how do you ensure that they stay healthy and that they have places, you know, to live. So I think it's, to me, that's what's so sort of fascinating. It's about those kind of networks.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, obviously, that working in the Red Road, it was so multi-layered in that respect, in terms of, you know, who is a local. When you have, you know, ultimately a contemporary housing estate only opened in 1969. So in terms of historic terms, it was still quite a new population on what was previously Greenbelt. But then anybody that was still living in the flats in 2004, who had moved in, you know, they were the original people. And then you'd had lots of different generations of people come through, and then, you know, with the final kind of movement of the refugees through the flats, you know, they were the kind of newcomers, and they weren't stable. So just that notion of insider outsider was really complex and dynamic, because people who lived there, so were insiders, were still seen as outsiders.
Yeah.
And I was a real outsider.
Yes.
Coming in, helping, you know, working across these different, you know, but it brings you back to the concept of community and validity of, obviously, there's another dimension working with refugees, which is about entitlement to be.
Yes.
To be in a place that's different from being from a place.
Yeah.
So there's lots of complicated dynamics within that, and I guess what we were trying to do, which I totally badly messed up on trying to articulate any of it, with that final event, was, so the soundscape was layered from many different sources, from interviews, from choirs, old songs, and all that kind of thing. It was really just trying to draw all that together and create a space where these multiple realities for a moment could coexist.
Yeah.
And you know, that is history, isn't it?
Yeah. And we've got some great comments and questions coming in now from our audience. Tom, would you like to turn your audio and your video on to ask your questions to the panel?
Yeah, I had a
thank you. It's like
fascinating a day in a variety of things. Yeah, I mean, even that some of the examples that's been shown today and other stuff that I am aware of in a variety of settings. Yeah, I just wondered if any effort was being made kind of nationally or centrally in some way to record what's been done at the moment, like as was mentioned, the Red Road Work website isn't accessible, and hopefully that work is archived somewhere. A lot of individual photographers working just have their own stuff in boxes with no future way of it being archived. And I'm aware from digging into some pictures of my own from years ago in a local authority archive, where some of that is, I've come across an enormous quantity of other photographers' work throughout the kind of 20th century that seems to be unrecorded and generally unseen. Has anyone ever, to the knowledge of anyone on the panel, done a formal audit, which is, I guess, a huge job of all these kind of local authority, university, other collections, even things that have formally been archived? Yeah, that's my question, really.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Over to the panel.
I don't. The short answer, Tom, I think, is no. There isn't a kind of comprehensive audit of all those collections. Although I know that for some time, you know, there's been sort of talk in various sort of camps about trying to kind of link up systems, and almost like along the Art UK model, where, you know, a lot of the public collections are sort of accessible from that one website, and they've done it with paintings, they've done it, I think, with sculpture now as well. That there could be, you know, sort of something similar, but also, I suspect it's just the sheer volume of work, because, you know, we've got about 55,000 photographs at the National Galleries of Scotland, and we're still cataloguing them. Not everything is sort of fully recorded. I don't know what you know, the sort of the state of other sort of collections would be, and you know, in archives and local authority collections up and down, but I imagine very similar. So it would take, I think, a tremendous amount of resource and funding, but it would be absolutely phenomenal to have a centralized source. Absolutely.
Yeah, it looks like my camera's not working. Not to worry.
Oh, we can hear you.
Yeah. So no, I was just thinking, it's not really a formulated thing, but I think a lot about the whole thing of the effect of issues around child protection on street photography, on documenting people's just ordinary everyday lives. And I've kind of come across it even in, you know, one of my incarnations, I've been involved in things like photographing kids at their Holy Communion, for instance, because I live in Donegal. And so I do various things to earn a living. And in the past few years, there's been issues around that, about the idea there's signs everywhere saying, you know, don't document, you know, being careful about photographing when some child could end up in the background of a picture and things like that. It's obviously a lot of the work that was shown, a lot of the older work, even right up to the 1990s, that was shown, wouldn't have existed in those circumstances. It just raises a lot of questions, I think, about the future of the ability to make these kinds of documents that really capture what society is like in a moment. You know, I don't know what other people. It's not I haven't formulated it. It's just it concerns me, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I think with that, it kind of depends on what you look at as art. Do you know what you consider to be the pinnacle of documentation of society, and what we look at in archives as what we should be sharing and what we should be collecting as well, because there are so many people everywhere who are taking these pictures with consent of the family, of their friends, do you know? And if you were to say to them, can we put it in an archive? I think people would be quite happy about that, actually. And it's a very nuanced discussion, which I don't know that we're going to have enough time to get into.
No.
It definitely feeds into what we were talking about with the insider outsider thing as well, because there can be lots of different intentions with photography and who you're photographing and what you're photographing, which is actually why I don't take pictures of people.
It's difficult. Yeah. And I was thinking, even supposing you're doing something like, I mean, I'm quite interested in how, like, maybe if anybody's got any thoughts about what the Cran Hill Arts Project was trying to do with the project they did with, like, in their still, they obviously put it online where people were submitting just their snapshots, their family snapshots. And, you know, there's obviously issues around, you know, that being made public, people's private lives being made public and that, but as you say, they've got consent. I just wondered what people's thoughts were around that. And on another line, I had another question, which was around, does anybody know what happened with all the work that was done in the 1990s in Castlemilk? Because I know that I've talked to the Castle woman, it was the arts officer there, and she doesn't know whether it's been preserved in any way, online or offline.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Martha. Anything else that the panel want to kind of come back to? I think Malcolm's put some response to your thing about Castlemilk. But anybody else want to make any more comment about consent? We've probably got time for two more once we finish responding to Martha's. There's one more question. One's a simple question. One's a longer question from Alishia that I'd like to do before we end up having to wrap up.
I'd like to say just something more on consent. I mean, I think it's from a kind of institutional point of view. I mean, it is a question that we ask. You know, do you have the consent? Have people signed the release forms? We don't need to sort of necessarily see them or keep them on record, but we just need to sort of do our due diligence in knowing that step has happened, and certainly. Like the work that I showed at the end with Margaret Mitchell, when we were acquiring that for the collection, I mean, Margaret and I did have a conversation about, well, and do the family know that it's going to come in to the National Collection, and that we are actually going to put it on the walls of an exhibition. And, and so she had those conversations with her family members, and they were obviously on board with that, and that was fine, and then did in fact come through to see the exhibition when it was up. But I think it's about transparency and about everybody just having those open conversations and being aware. And there can be certain laws depending on what country you're in, and how the images themselves are used as well. That it's it can often be a kind of case by case situation. But I think that it's back to what Alishia was saying in terms of the intent behind it, and then just making sure that all the sort of necessary steps have been made. And there has been situations where, when we've had those conversations with photographers and they haven't, we've said, well, can you go back and get permission retroactively? And they have done so. And then there's also been situations where we've been acquiring work and in having those honest, candid conversations with photographers, they've said actually these sitters are no longer comfortable with the work of them being represented that way, and so we've just made other selections. So I really think the onus is just on having those conversations with everybody involved.
I mean, obviously I was thinking about things like, if you look at the huge Oscar Mazzaroli archive, that consent doesn't come into that because it's street photography. It's not somebody that's being asked to sit down for a picture. He's out there in the world just photographing what's there, and it's that aspect that obviously how do you deal with that? Obviously Street Level has been doing that huge project, But it's that aspect of photography I'm thinking about as well, though. It's the incidental, where you can't get permission from people because they don't necessarily know, or you maybe weren't aware that you took the photograph, or if they were, they're off somewhere else and there's no way of tracing them. I mean, I don't know, how do you deal with that?
Thanks.
Massive issue.
Yeah.
Personal thing for each photographer. I mean, you know, with social media being what it is, I think, ironically, that kind of issue of child protection online is less of an issue today than it was 10 years ago. I've certainly found that working in schools, where 10 years ago it was, you know, there were lots of rules and regulations over documentation and it not going online. Now a lot of schools have their own Facebook and Twitter pages, and kids are constantly being uploaded to social media. So things are changing all the time. Yeah.
We're coming near to the end. There's two questions I'd like to squeeze in. Thanks again, Martha, for that. There's some more comments in the chat along that theme. Isla Stack, sorry if I'm pronouncing your first name incorrectly. She just says here, I became aware of Edith Tudor Hart's archive whilst attending When We Were Young seminar. Is the archive accessible to visit?
Not at the moment, I'm afraid, because of pandemic situation. Although the portrait gallery is open to the public, the visiting of the print room and the archive is not yet open. But we are hoping that will change in the coming months. The images are, however, on the website, so you can sort of look at them there, but hopefully in a few months' time, be able to come visit in person.
Thanks for it's good to have this practical information as well. But yeah, the reality of trying to visit archives at the moment still got some challenges there, and because we are running out of time, so if I could just, Alishia, would you like to ask your question to the panel?
I could. Hello, namesake. I'll put on my video. I'm just mindful of your time as well. Hi everyone. So I had a bit of a long one. I suppose it was a head milling one as well, but it was about working men's clubs, and I'm speaking as somebody whose family's got working men's clubs as well, and I hate that name, working men's clubs, because it's mannies and wifeys as far as I'm concerned. But how do these clubs, bingo halls and community centres be preserved and continue to be appreciated by communities? And I guess I'm thinking more about the social attitudes that exist now, and there's a sort of homogenization of spaces, and there's also a bit of mocking of these spaces, you know, people go in for a laugh, if you like, and we've all been in those sort of situations if we've taken friends to family events and stuff, and they see, oh well, this is how you socialize. How can we preserve them and help people to really appreciate the magic of them before they go, or before they get changed into something capitalist and homogenized?
Give them my email address and I'll tell them why they're important.
Well,
I do think that generally when it comes to these spaces, it's about continuation of use. Do you know, it's about showing people that these spaces are worthwhile. And honestly, if we don't have them, what do we have?
yeah.
Especially in small areas, small towns, rural communities, they're generally one of the very few social spaces that are out there that's not a Wetherspoons, or, do you know, like you were saying, some kind of homogenized centre. So I really do think it's about speaking to people about how important they are, because if we don't use them and the generations after us don't use them, they're not going to be there anymore. Well, mostly our generation, if we don't use them, they're not going to be there because they won't be left. But these places, you know, these places are sometimes funded by local communities, sometimes funded by local authorities, but most of the time they're funded by the membership fees for the members that come and do it. So you pay maybe 50, 60 quid, you can go there for a whole year and get really cheap drinks if that's a selling.
Like
you can't turn your nose up at that, you know. And I think it's quite interesting that they're mocked, because I just think they're some of the most beautiful spaces in the world. I really do. I think they are so rich and they're so warm and they have so much heart. Why would you not want to spend your time there? But I'm biased because I love social clubs.
You're the converted. Well, you're not the converted. You're you're part of it as well. So I guess it's like the kind of wider, I'm thinking about my cousins as well, who are working class and who live in council estates and stuff like that, who would go to Wetherspoons or who would go to like a new place in town rather than the clubs. They might go to the first to get a few drinks with their mums and dads and then move on, rather than kind of appreciate that space on the doorstep. And I wonder if post lockdown that might change. I don't know.
It depends on the kind of the people who are at the head of these clubs, because they actually are bringing in, you know, heads of the board that are younger. There's a guy at Queen's Park, he was there a couple of years ago, he was the head of their board, and he's relatively young, and he brings in his running club.
Oh, brilliant, that's good.
And there's a social club just off Maynard Road in Shawlands in Glasgow that does full soul and funk nights, and it's really
nice.
fun. They bring out a wee tray of home baked goods in the middle of the night, you know, like it's just perfect. I don't know why you don't want to go anywhere else, but I think it's about finding how you kind of fit in to 2021, 2022, 2025. What can you offer in these spaces that means that they can be appreciated by future generations? Maybe that in itself will change the attitudes of people. It will change the kind of, oh, I don't want to go there, it's sticky carpets and the furniture's from the 1960s, do you know, like, ooh, that sort of thing makes it rejuvenated, do you know, that kind of furniture's come back in fashion as well, so.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Alishia, for that comment, for coming in there as well. So unfortunately, but it seems to be a good moment to start. We have ran out of time, but I wanted to say there are some really good comments coming up in the chat, and Simona has also raised this question of how photographers and archivists and collectors can navigate the challenges of when we're in abundance of imagery time that we're in, and what we're choosing to collect and archive for future generations. And it may be a good thing to kind of leave that on there, because you just see that we really are scratching the surface of our social history. And what I wanted to say is first of all, if we could say a big thanks to, if we were in the gallery together, we would be giving our speakers a round of applause. So we will just do either the signs or what have you. But so thank you for thank you our speakers for taking us through some very rich and complex and loaded territory as well. I'd like to thank John, who's behind the scenes, keeping us all in a kind of technical order, and apparently I was rattling my earphones against my zip, so I apologise for that earlier. And I'd also like to thank all the other street level staff who've supported all the events so far and the exhibition. So thank you for the audience. It was really great to at least be able to bring some of you into the conversation and try our kind of Zoom seminar session out. But again, thanks a lot to our contributors who have made this such a fascinating event. So enjoy, if there is sun still out there, enjoy it. If you've got a chance for a beer, enjoy that. If not, a cup of tea and a cake. Okay, right. Bye, everybody.